G'day and welcome to another episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups. On this episode, I'm going to show you how to replace a CV boot. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as well as leave your comments in the section below for things that you want to see me do. Now here at Tomo's Tune-Ups, I'm all about supporting everyone else. So as good as it is to get my name out there and branch out and get the subscribers and the likes and the comments, all that sort of stuff, I'm also about supporting everyone else. On today's episode, I want to have a shout out to my mate Benny at Benny's Custom Works. He does a lot of really intricate stuff with a lot of his race cars and as well as a lot of builds. So if you haven't checked him out already, see the link in the description below and head on over, hit subscribe and watch some of his videos. He's got some really good information and he's a really down-to-earth guy. So first things first, we're going to be replacing the CV boot on, you guessed it, a classic Mini, but this will go for most conventional vehicles out there if you need to replace one, whether it be a four-wheel drive or whether it just be a general passenger car. First thing we're going to need is a pair of latex gloves. The reason for this is it is one of the most messiest jobs you can ever do being a mechanic. It's not something that you want to attempt without them, and if you do, make sure you got some really good detergent or Solvol to help clean your hands afterwards. Now, not too long ago, I had a customer approach me and say, can you show me how to replace a CV boot? That way, if I need to do it on the side of the road or in the bush, I can do it. My response to her was simply, if you need to replace one of these on the side of the road or in the bush, you need to get it towed. Simply because if grease and dirt is going to get inside here and it's something that you think that you're going to want to replace, it's not something you want to do on the side of the road. It is a hard enough job to do it on a hoist, especially on a vehicle that has been raised 2 inches, for instance. To be able to get it out, it's probably going to take you good close to an hour. And then to be able to take it all off, strip it, reassemble it, re-grease it, put it back together without doing any damage with minimum tools, it's definitely not something you want to be doing on the side of the road. I did show her how to do it. It took us around 2 hours for us to do it on her car, simply because of the lift and equipment she had on there, but we ended up getting it done. So take it from me, if you need to replace this, either do it at home or take it to a professional to do it. So first thing first, we're going to stick it in the vise. So once it's in the vise, we're going to cut off the clamps on either end of the boot. Now once you cut these clamps, they're generally not reusable, so don't feel that you have to try and reuse it, because a lot of the time you're not going to be able to. Just grab yourself a razor blade or a knife, and we're just going to cut that boot all the way off. Now remember, there is a difference between both inner and outer boots. Some inner boots need to be used with a tripod joint CV boot. Now tri means 3, so it's going to have 3 roller bearings in there with slides as well, so you need to get the right boot to suit the application. So once that's been cut, we're then going to remove it. This one is in pretty good condition. There's not a lot of grease on the inside, which isn't a bad thing, but it's also a good thing. It just makes our life a little bit easier. Now most of these CV joints are going to be held on by a circlip internally. So inside the shaft there's going to be a little groove with a circlip, and the groove is going to be on the CV joint side. So as it goes on, it's going to lock itself there. So that's what's going to prevent the CV joint from coming out from the shaft. In order to remove the CV joint off the shaft, we need to apply force. So in that case, we're going to get a hammer and probably a drift and just give it a couple of taps in order for it to come off. Now I did forget to mention that when you remove the CV joint, make sure that if you can't get the shaft out of the hub, you reapply the nut so the nut is completely flat against the end of the shaft. Then that way you can hit it with a hammer. The reason for this is if you apply force to the end of the CV joint where the threaded section is, and you don't have the nut on there, it's going to mushroom the head of the threads over, which means you're not going to be able to get the nut on. So if you have the nut on there and it's completely flat in line with the end of the shaft, when you hit it, if it is going to start to mushroom, when you start to loosen the nut and wind it out, it's going to recut the thread. Now, if you can't get the drive shaft out of the hub, sometimes you need to either apply some heat, some lubricant, or even take the entire stub axle out, put it in a press, and then apply some pressure. Now, to remove the CV joint, we want to be applying pressure here with either a punch or a drift. We don't want to be applying any pressure on the outside, especially on the bearings themselves. So with a couple of good hits, she's almost come off. and now the CV joint's come off from the shaft. Now the circlip I was talking to you about before is this one here. So this sits internally within the CV joint and locates it and prevents it coming off. Now this one here is the end stop. So that's what stops the CV joint going any further inwards. Make sure that if they have a new one of these, you replace it as well as the new circlip. So you want to grab the old CV joint and give it a bit of a clean. It doesn't need to be perfect, but you want to try and clean it up as best as you possibly can. You also want to make sure that all the ball bearings are inside the cage. So this one here is the cage, and these are the ball bearings inside here. So this one's got 6 bearings. All of them appear to be intact. There's no wear marks at all. Nothing's missing, nothing's broken. Sometimes when these shafts break, the cage will destroy itself and all the bearings will start to come out. That's what you want to keep an eye out for when replacing these, or even checking to see if there's any damage to it. Then we're going to grab our new CV boot, and we're going to start the assembly process. So the first thing we want to be doing is getting our CV boot and sliding it on. You want to slide it down as far as you can. Now this one doesn't come with anything other than new grease, a new boot and 2 cable ties. So in this case, we're just going to be filling the boot full of grease and not replacing any of the circlips. All we want to do here is just get the grease. We're going to cut it open with a razor blade, and then we're going to fill the boot full of grease, but also we want to be putting a little bit of grease around the edge of the bearings here. So we'll start with that first. All we want to be doing is just smearing a little bit on there, just like this. And then remember, any excess, you can always just smear it around with your hand. Now the CV joint is going to act as a centrifuge. So as it starts to speed up, all of the grease inside there is going to start to want to fly out. And that's fine. That's what we want. We want to make sure that there's enough grease inside here. That way when it starts to speed up, it's going to be full of grease. Generally the grease tub that they give you with the CV boot kit is more than enough to be able to fill it full of grease and use it all. Make sure that if you don't have enough grease in these, or you need to get some more, you get grease that is solely designed for CV boots. So constant velocity boot grease is what you're going to need. Because it is under high temperature and speed the entire time it's in operation, you need to make sure that the grease is capable of meeting the standards. Usually what you do is smear a little bit of grease around the outside of the CV joint and then smear the rest inside the boot. But in this case, there's not a lot of grease, so we're going to put a little bit more inside the joint. Now going back to what I've been saying in previous episodes, if you want to be hitting something with a hammer, make sure that the compound you're hitting it with is softer than the compound you are hitting. The reason for this is, like I said before, if you're going to hit this with a steel hammer, the steel hammer is going to be harder than this, which is then going to cause the end to mushroom over, which then means you're not going to be able to get the nut back on. In our case, we're going to grab a soft face hammer and we're going to apply it to the end of the CV joint to apply it back to the shaft. Now, a lot of time what you'll find is the circlip over time has expanded too much and therefore won't allow you to put the CV joint back on. So what you need to do is line it up, get a small screwdriver, start to push it on and then drive the circlip in. That way it will seat inside the CV joint. There we go. So I've just lined up the clip. Now it is in all the way. If you're ever unsure, give it a couple of good taps. Once it's changed pitch, then you know it's gone all the way home. Now the next thing to do is align the CV boot with the joint. Okay, there we are. So a lot of the time, the reason why you replace a CV joint or even a CV shaft, or in our case a CV boot, is because it's not only split, but it's noisy. Now when you're driving down the road and you're doing 20 k's an hour, you want to turn into your driveway. You're slowing down, you're going full lock and you're turning into the left. All the weight shifts to the right hand side of the car, which then loads up the joint. So if you're turning left at a slow car bike speed and you get a noise like a constant clicking or a ticking noise, it's likely going to be the right hand side CV shaft. Vice versa, when you're turning right, it is going to be the left hand side. Don't get confused that it can be mistaken that it is the opposite side depending on what application and what vehicle you have. Some Subarus, I know for instance, if they are noisy, they will happen the side that you are turning. So for instance, if you're turning right, it will be the right hand side. So if you're ever unsure, get someone else to check it or seek professional advice. Now the only clamps that they supply us are a couple of cable ties. This isn't the most ideal situation, but we can use these to get away with it. Ideally, you want to try and use the metal clamps that they have. So we're going to slide that around the outside. We're going to slide it all the way through, and we're going to pull it tight. Now on the inside of the shaft, it has a small groove as well. So we want to make sure that you line up the boot with the groove. That way when you tighten up the cable tie, it has something to seat in. And grab the big one as well. That'll go around the outside. Do the exact same thing. This also has a groove on the inside of the CV joint. Grab yourself a pair of pliers and pull it taut. Now here's Tomo's handy tip of the day. Get yourself a razor blade whenever you're using cable ties. Don't just use a pair of side cutters or scissors, simply because how many times have you gone to work on your car or someone else's and you've stuck your hand down somewhere really tight and someone's put a cable tie there, they've cut it and there's a sharp edge and it slits your wrist open. I can tell you that's happened to me more times than I've probably had baked dinners or most recently had haircuts. So grab yourself a razor blade, hold it right towards the bottom edge, slide it all the way across, cut it, that way it's nice and clean. I can run my hand along here, I can even run my wrist along there, I'm not going to slice my hand open. Not only that, but it also looks neat and professional. So that's it guys, that's how you replace a CV boot on your vehicle. Don't forget that when you are removing it, soak it in plenty of penetrant, that way you can ensure that it is going to come out nice and freely. So stay tuned guys, the next couple of episodes are going to be quite fun. I'm going to be installing a new diff on the A+ 1275 engine. We're also going to be fitting new brake lines, rebuilding brake calipers, as well as hubs on the Mark II Cooper S. Until then guys, stay COVID safe. Fingers crossed we're out of lockdown sooner rather than later. And I'll see you next time on an episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups, all things DIY and mechanical.